14. Now, the Apollo program, for any perhaps of our younger people out here today, the Apollo program was the program that NASA launched in the 1960s and early 1970s that put people on the moon. Okay, there were 6 successful missions that got to the moon, and Apollo 14 in 1971 was the 3rd of those missions that got to the moon. Now, the Apollo spacecraft and the Apollo configuration was the same throughout all of these missions as they were testing the journey to the moon and as they were landing on the moon. You had this massive, whacking great rocket called the Saturn rocket, and that was the rocket that got the astronauts off the surface of the Earth, away from the gravity, Earth's gravity. And on top of that rocket was something called the Command and Service Module, which is where the astronauts were. And that was once the rocket had done its job, the Command and Service Module was the piece of equipment that took them, the spacecraft that took them 250,000 miles to the moon. Now, tucked in behind the Command and Service Module was something called the Lunar Module. Now, the Lunar Module was the bit of equipment that they used to get from the Command and Service Module down to the surface of the moon. So Apollo 14, we had 3 astronauts. There were 3 astronauts in each of the missions. We had Stuart Roosa, and he was the pilot of the Command and Service Module. And he piloted the spaceship to the moon, and then he stayed in orbit 69 miles above the surface of the moon. And our 2 astronauts, Alan Shepard and Ed Mitchell, were the ones that got into the lunar module to descend to the surface of the moon. Now, the lunar module was quite an ungainly looking piece of kit. It's like a kind of, best way to describe it, it's like a giant golf ball on sticks, really. It wouldn't be much good flying through the Earth's atmosphere, but it was perfect for going down to the surface of the moon. So our astronauts got inside it, and down they descended. Now, the lunar module was quite small, okay? In fact, it's very small. Now, kids, very important never to jump on your mum and dad's bed, right? But if you were to jump on your mum and dad's bed, and your mum and dad had an average-sized double bed, there's a roughly 4.5 cubic meters between the outline of the mattress and the ceiling. And that 4.5 cubic meters is roughly how much space there was inside the lunar module. Pretty cozy for 2 astronauts. Now, they had to be in there with everything they needed for a couple of days, and that included their spacesuits. They had the giant spacesuits that they were going to walk out onto the surface of the moon with. So pretty cozy in that 4.5 meters of space. So our astronauts descend to the surface of the moon. Now, in Apollo 14, there was a little bit of a hiccup. And the hiccup was that the lunar module landed on a slight slope. It was a 7-degree slope that it landed on, and that wasn't quite what they'd planned for. So now nobody was quite sure whether that was going to be okay. The scientists back on Earth were not quite sure because the gravity is different. So they didn't really know if the lunar module was going to stand there comfortably or it was actually going to topple over. Pretty scary. I mean, it's not like a caravan. You can't just nip outside and jack one of the legs up, you know. It's kind of, that's how it lands and that's how it is. So they couldn't give the astronauts any confidence. They just said, well, we don't know, you know. So that's pretty scary. Now, the Apollo program was brand new. Nobody had ever done this before, and they were learning as they went along. And one of the things they learned on Apollo 11, which was the first mission that successfully put people on the moon, was that they hadn't really planned for how the astronauts were going to sleep. So on Apollo 11, they really struggled to sleep. They slept, basically sat upright in their spacesuits, and they really didn't sleep. And that's not a good idea if you've got astronauts that tired for a couple of days and they can't get any sleep on the moon. So by the time they got to Apollo 12 and then Apollo 14, they had designed a kind of a hammock system. And there wasn't much space, just enough space to sling these hammocks across the lunar module. They couldn't even fit them kind of side by side. They had to be like bunk hammocks, is the only way to describe it. And even then, they couldn't fit one on top of the other. They had to be perpendicular. So you had one hammock across the top, and then very cozy, the second hammock with the second astronaut kind of at crossways underneath them. Pretty tight, pretty cozy, okay? So, So our astronauts are there, Ed and Alan are there, trying their best to get some sleep. Now the problem with trying to sleep, they've got a number of problems. First of all, they've got noises going on all around them, and it's the pumps, the various different pumps that are keeping the life support system in the lunar module working. But they've also got the problem of low gravity, and that gives them a really weird sensation anyway, very, very strange. Now, if you add on top of that the 7-degree tilt, I mean, who went camping in the summer? Anyone pitched their tent on a slope? Yeah, nightmare trying to sleep, isn't it? You get that feeling all the way through the night that you're going to sort of roll over. Well, they were getting that feeling, so they were getting this sensation that in low gravity, that the lunar module was tipping over. Horrendous, trying to sleep, and they had all this noise going on. Now, we know what was going on inside the lunar module because there is a voice recording of everything that the astronauts said. So we know their conversation. And in the middle of the night, well, it's not actually the middle of the night. If there's any scientists here, it's not the night because they're on the moon, but that's complicated. We won't go into that. It's astronaut sleepy bye-bye time. That's all we need to know. And they are doing their best to get some sleep. And in the night, Alan is woken up by a loud noise. And the conversation goes like this. Alan says, he whispers to Ed, he says, Ed, wake up. And Ed wakes up and says, what is it? Alan says, did you hear that noise? What was it? And Ed says, I don't know. And with that, Alan says, Ed. And Ed says, what is it? And Alan says, Ed, why are we whispering? Isn't that a lovely story? Isn't that a lovely story? And I've told you that story because I cannot think of a better illustration of intimacy between two people than those astronauts 250,000 miles away from the Earth, 69 miles away from the nearest human who can't get to them anyway, in a capsule, whispering to each other. And we're looking at the subject of intimacy today. Now, we're not looking at the subject of intimacy in terms of physical relationships. We're looking at the other definition of intimacy, which is closeness, physical and emotional closeness between two people. Okay, that's what we're looking at. And I want you to hold the story of the astronauts in your head as we unpick the Bible. And if I could please have the verse on the screen, fantastic. And we're going to be looking at the same story as we've heard acted out. And this is the story. It's from Luke 10. And we're going to look at it. We're going to look at Mary and Martha as we look at intimacy. So Luke 10, 38-42. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way home, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he'd said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, the story of Mary and Martha is actually the story of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. It's a family, okay? And there's quite a lot about Lazarus, Mary, and Martha in the Bible. We've got this little bit in Luke, and we've also got quite a lot. We've got two stories, effectively, and they go across John 11 and John 12. And there's a little bit too much for us to read the whole thing this morning. So what I suggest is during the week, you might want to read the John account, and then you can check that what I've said is correct. And what we can use is we can use the two accounts together to give a slightly different flavour, but we can use them together to get a better understanding of Mary and Martha. So the context here is a family. So it's a family of brothers and sisters. So Lazarus is the brother, and Mary and Martha are the two sisters. And they live together in a town called Bethany that's a short distance outside of Jerusalem. Now this family the John account tells us are friends of Jesus and the disciples. In fact, it goes a little bit further than that, and it actually says in John that Jesus loved Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. So this is not a story about some kind of random people. And you could be forgiven if you read the Luke account. You might think of these people as just perhaps somebody that Jesus came across Because there are lots of other people that Jesus came across in the Gospels, aren't they? Just people he came across. This isn't the case at all. This is a chance for us to read stories about his friends from when he was here on earth. So Mary and Martha, we know from the John account, are his close friends. So that's quite important context, isn't it? So there are these two stories about Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Now, the first story starts with a bit of a tragedy. So Lazarus gets real sick. And the message gets to Jesus and his disciples that Lazarus is really sick. And Jesus says to the disciples, Lazarus is going to die. But don't worry, I'm going to bring him back to life again. I'm telling the John account as a little bit of a story here, and you can read it yourselves during the week. So the disciples are like, wow, that's great. Well, we're going to come see that. We're going to come with you. Now, it was a little bit dangerous to travel at the time because there was already a little bit of bad stuff going on, and there were some threats against Jesus, but they said, we're going to come with you. So they all went to Bethany. But they actually went to Bethany a few days later. Jesus delayed. He left it a little while before he went to Bethany. So when he arrived, Martha meets him outside Bethany and says, Jesus, you're too late. You're too late. Lazarus has already died. If you'd been here a bit earlier, you could have saved him. Now that tells us something about the Martha that we've read in Luke. What that tells us is that Martha had more than just a friendship with Jesus. She had an understanding that he was special. She knew that he had some kind of power over life and death. In fact, it goes further. In John, what it says is Jesus asks Martha in a conversation, do you believe I'm the Messiah? And she says yes. So that tells us about Martha. Martha has a faith. She believes in Jesus. And the next part of the story, we go on to understand another feature of Martha. It doesn't specifically say that Martha is kind, but I think when you read it, that's the message it's conveying. Because what happens next is Martha goes off and finds her sister. They're all in distress, they're all mourning, but she goes, finds her sister, and tells her that Jesus has arrived. And the way that account is written, I think when you read it, it's portraying a sense that Martha is compassionate, is kind. Now, the next part of the story is amazing. So Jesus goes to the tomb and raises Lazarus from the dead. Absolutely amazing. And this is where we find out that Martha is not only have a faith and not only kind and compassionate, but is also quite practical. Because when Jesus says, roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb, I'm going to raise Lazarus from the dead, Martha's reaction is, you don't want to do that, it's going to be stinky. Okay, that's what she says, words to that effect. So quite a practical person is our Martha, quite practical. And then Jesus goes on and raises Lazarus from the dead. Absolutely incredible event. And that's the first account. Now the second account is this account of a meal. And we've got two accounts. We've got an account in John 12 and we've got the account in Luke. Now we don't know the exact time that's passed between Lazarus being raised from the dead and this meal. There are some clues, because in the John account it talks about a certain number of days before Passover, and scholars who are a lot cleverer than me can kind of put together a timeline of how things work. And what they say to us is that it's more likely that it was days and weeks between these two events than months and years. Okay, so we don't know the exact time frame, but it's relatively soon after. So it's an incredible episode in the life of this family. Lazarus has come back from the dead, and there's a meal. Now, I don't know about you, in my household, there's some kind of algorithm that Wendy uses. Sorry, Wendy. To do with kind of, if you do something nice for us as a family, what you get. So, if you do something nice for us, you might get a phone call to say thank you. Right. If you do something really, really nice, you might get a phone call and an email. If you do something really, really nice, you might get a phone call, an email, and a handwritten note. You know, these little handwritten notes, real special. If you do something really, really, really nice, you might get all of those and a bunch of flowers, or maybe a bottle of wine. And if you do something really, 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 really nice, you might get invited round for a meal. What do you do for the guy that's raised you from the dead? Unbelievable. Now, I'm making this up completely. I'm adding to this, so forgive me for this, but I'm imagining this kind of conversation around the kitchen table between Lazarus and his two sisters, right? And Lazarus saying, yeah, it's a couple of weeks now since he raised from the dead. I'm thinking I ought to maybe get a present for Jesus. You know, I was thinking I might send him a little jar of wine or something like that. And his sister's going, oh, come on, Lazarus, you can do better than that. And Lazarus saying, well, okay, you know, maybe we could do a meal. Can you help with the catering, sis? You know, something like that. I've just made that story up. I've made it up completely. But the point is, the illustration is, the point is that this is a special meal. That's what we know from the context. This is a special meal. This is not, and when you read the Luke account, you miss this context completely. This is not Jesus popping in for a coffee with a couple of people that he's met en route. This is an incredible meal in the life of a family whose brother has just been raised from the dead. A few weeks, maybe at most a month later, and Jesus has come round. Now we know from the two accounts together that Jesus was there, Mary was there, we know Martha was there, and in the other account, we also know that Judas Iscariot was there. So, if one of the disciples were there, and we already know the disciples travelled to Bethany, we can make a guess that maybe there were more disciples there. It doesn't say, but we're getting this picture of this being quite an important meal, aren't we? That's the context here. This is a big celebration. And within that context then, it makes a bit more sense where Martha's saying she's got all these preparations to make. It makes a bit more sense now, doesn't it? Because of course she's got lots of preparations to make, because this is a really, really big deal. And that tells us something else about Martha, because Martha, we already know, is a believer. We already know she's compassionate. We know she's practical. And we know she likes to serve because she's there getting everything ready. Are you sensing some familiarity with this character of Martha? Okay. So you have a faith. You believe Jesus died for you. You're being as kind as you can to those around you. You're practical where you can be. You're trying to serve. Perhaps you're involved in the life of the church in some way, trying to serve others. It's kind of like familiar territory here, isn't it? Yeah? And then we got this other character, Mary. Wow. And what Mary's doing is Mary is just sat at Jesus' feet listening to him. Now, in the other account in John, it goes even further. So Mary, in the other account in John, takes a jar of expensive perfume and breaks it on Jesus' feet and wipes it away with her hair. That's an extravagant form of worship, self-sacrificing form of worship. So if we go back to our astronauts at the beginning, where are you? Are you 250,000 miles away? You know this story about Jesus is going on. You can see about it on the TV. You can read about it. You're not really quite sure what's going on with these astronauts on the moon, but, you know, that's where you are. Are you 69 miles away? Are you in orbit? You're involved. You know what's going on. They're your friends down there on the surface of the moon. You've got this relationship with Jesus, but it's distant. Or are you as close to Jesus as two astronauts, 250,000 miles away from Earth, 69 miles away from the nearest person they know, in a tiny metal can, just whispering to each other? Can I pray for you? May you know the true depth of the love that Jesus has for you. This week, may you find time to spend time just sat at his feet listening. May you, this week, find a way to extravagantly worship him. And through this week, may you experience true intimacy that Jesus has to offer you. Amen.